Hello, everyone. It's good to see you for another Sunday morning Bible study. It's really good to see the rain outside. That's a lovely sight. We are in John 10. Though we had our sermon from John 10, we actually did not get into any Bible class material. So we're going to be doing a bit of introductory material, laying out some foundation for where this is going to go, and then get into a few verses, maybe up to verse 6. But we're going to spend some time in the Old Testament as well, because there are a lot of things, there's a lot of connection between what Jesus is presenting here in John 10, and specifically about him being the good shepherd, and the contrast that you find with Old Testament prophets. For example, we're going to look at a little bit of Ezekiel, and we're going to read some of Jeremiah, and how that there's same language being used with those prophets to describe and discuss the problems that Israel was having way back at that point in their history. And as we have studied in our Matthew class, and even going through this John material, we are emphasizing just how much callback and reference there is to the Old Testament, and because these are people that are supposed to know these things. So then for Jesus to come along, or John, the immerser for that matter, to come along and to use these passages, it should just automatically trigger something in the mind of a Jew. It's like, oh, we know what he's talking about. That sounds exactly like Isaiah, or that sounds exactly like Daniel, so on and so forth. And so this next section that Jesus is going to lay out flows directly from what we've studied in chapter 9. All of this has its connection to the healing of the blind man, and that conversation afterwards about dealing with the Pharisees, and how that if you were blind, you would have no sin, but because you say that you see, you're still remaining in your sin. And so we don't need to miss this connection. So Jesus now gives a picture to contrast from what is happening in chapter 9. The Pharisees are the leaders of the day. Now, granted, even though, and that's really the wild thing about it, who is in charge of the temple at this time?
Isn't it the Pharisees?
No,
Would it be the Sadducees?
it's the Sadducees. So the Sadducees, the high priest, Caiaphas, and then his son-in-law, I can't remember son-in-law's name right now. Annas, thank you. They are part of the Sadducee group and not the Pharisee group, which is pretty wild considering that the Sadducees don't believe in eternity, the soul, the angelic beings and everything like that. It just makes you wonder how in the world could they possibly be in charge right now. So here you have the Pharisees not even in charge per se of the temple system, but yet they're running around making all these rules and regulations that people are needing to follow, and that they are the primary ones that Jesus has so much contradiction and battle against. But the contrast that is trying to be set up is that you have the Pharisees as, quote unquote, the leaders. They are supposed to be the guiders. They wanted to be Israel's shepherds, but they are failing miserably in what it is that they're trying to do. They are blind spiritually. They cannot see God. They cannot see correctly His Word, and so they cannot correctly see themselves, and thus they cannot correctly see others. And yet here they are, not able to see correctly, and they're trying to lead a multitude of people. And as Jesus said in Matthew 15, the only place that's going to end up leading them to is into the ditch. And the ditch being a representation of condemnation, destruction, punishment. So now Jesus presents himself as the Good Shepherd. The complete opposite of what the Pharisees were, what the leadership of their day was, and even to what we're dealing with in our day and age. And we're talking about bad leadership all around. Bad leadership inside of the Lord's church, inside of the Church of Christ, and outside in these denominations as well. That the contrast is being set. Yeah, you have all these different people that are trying to take you in all these different directions. All you're needing to follow is me. But then also as we're going through this, we're going to have again established for us the firm foundation that we can have, that we know what truth is. That we're not just out here wandering around in the dark just hoping to find our way. The way is being led. And that we're just needing to walk in it. So John 10:1, well, just to get verse 40 and 41 of John 9, some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words and said unto him, Are we blind also? Jesus said unto them, If you were blind, you should have no sin, but now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. Now, we have some strong language being used here. Being out here in Montana, out here in the West, call somebody a thief or a robber, those are fighting words. And in a lot of western states, which I think is back east too, you were a cattle thief, horse thief, what happened to you? Yeah, we lynch you. Is it really? Man, we need to start implementing that a little bit more. Now, and yes, that would imply to slashing tires because that technically is my horse. So,
Horsepower.
right, exactly. So, here's this strong language that's being used. Who's Jesus talking about? Who's the thieves? Who's the robbers?
Well, the Pharisees are thieves.
Okay. Here he is using these strong words, and he's looking these people dead in the eye. He's not talking about some people that are off over here. These are people right here in front of him that are in midst of conversation with him.
Who just an hour or whatever time period before were picking up the stones to stone him.
Exactly. They are, like, throughout all of this, they are in the midst of trying to conspire. How are we going to get rid of him? So here are these religious folk. Now, when we put this into the framework or into the parameters of where we are today and what people say that you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to be in evangelism, do you think they're happy with what they would read here? Do you think they would even take this into consideration? Or would they not, in fact, even some of our own brethren, be like the Baptists and just, well, let's just read over that like they do Acts 2:38? Not even taking this into consideration. And then I can hear people saying, well, that won't get them to change. Yes, it will, if they have an honest heart. What was that? What's going on here? Oh.
Flies
Sorry.
everywhere.
Normally I don't notice stuff, but that was just way too dramatic to overlook. So, again, Jesus is not holding back on what needs to be said. And especially to a group of people that are just as rotten as the Pharisees are. He's not tiptoeing around it. He's not petting them on the head. Oh, you guys are just doing what you can, trying to, make your way through it. Here's what you are. thieves and robbers. And especially considering, hold on to it, and especially considering what we've already studied in our Matthew study. Matthew 23, what's one of the woes? And why? In connection with thieves and robbers.
Well, they're taking from the widows.
There you go. For pretense, and that pretense, that word pretense means to make a show, which is what a hypocrite is, a person playing a role, playing a part. For pretense, you make long prayers, but then they turn around and they devour widows' houses. Thieves and robbers. We have no room for people like that in society. That's not the kind of people you want hanging around. And you call it for what it is. Thieves and robbers. Go ahead, Jamie.
Well, my question to you is, you're talking about the application now, and you're saying well, our brethren would want to gloss over this or whatever. Do they even quantify this? Do they say that, oh, this is evangelism right here? Or is evangelism when you take somebody into a quiet room and you speak gently and you open your Bible up quietly and that sort of thing?
Well, and it all goes back to the situation. I mean, why is it that Jesus could speak strongly to Nicodemus, but yet it's nothing like this? Because Nicodemus is not a fighter. He is coming to Jesus, genuinely asking, and being one of those people that's seeking and going to find. But then here we are in this situation. Let's also not forget, what have they just done to the blind man in John 9?
Cast him out.
Communicated.
You have just cast him out, excommunicated and withdrawn from him. Here is a innocent. Here is somebody that should be protected. And this is how you're treating them? You don't get any mercy. And that goes back to our Matthew study. Blessed are the merciful. Why?
For they shall obtain mercy.
For they shall receive mercy.
Receive.
If you don't give it, you don't get it. And that is an important aspect as to like the fierceness that's going on here. Yes, Jesus is the Lamb of Judah, but he's also what in the Revelation?
Lion.
The lion. And when it comes to the head lion dealing with his pride, the lion protects his pride. And that's the other lions, not his emotional pride. Yes, not his ego.
I mean.
He is protecting the ones that are underneath him, that are looking for him to protect them. And that's what we have happening here. So when we're thinking about this, it also says something about, so going back to Jamie's question, I would argue that a lot of our brethren are not studying this the way that we are in connection back to John 9. And that the fact that we have moved on to a whole new chapter, just, okay, we're moving on to a whole new subject matter. But that's not the case. And that when you take into consideration those events, everything else that Jesus has already done in front of their view to try to help them along, and then here are these we know people, Pharisees, and we know what you're up to. You're trying to conspire to murder me and everything like that. And here you are mistreating this poor person. Okay, the gloves are coming off. And with some people, that's the only way. That's the only form of communication that they know. That's the only way that they know how to be handled. And that's how the Pharisees handle everybody. They're going around abusing people, being authoritative. That's the only thing they respond to. So, okay, here comes Jesus and he's authoritative. You think you're something, but you're really not. You think you're holy and that you're righteous, but in fact, you guys are thieves and robbers. And the reality is that everybody else knows this too. You don't think the widows, you don't think they know that the Pharisees are thieves and robbers? Oh, they know it. But what are they supposed to do? They're the helpless ones. They need somebody to come along and stand up for them. And here's Jesus, and he's doing that. Yeah, there's a look.
Well, I have to find it, but I don't know if it's somewhere around Obadiah or whatever, where God confirms that He is the defender of widows and orphans.
Right? So, I mean, yeah, so it's all throughout the prophets. Isaiah mentions it a lot. And it's just because, I mean, when you have a bully, the bully is always going to look for the easiest target. He's always going to look for the weakest person to go after. He's not going to go after somebody his own size because he doesn't want that pushback. Isaiah talks about it a lot. Moses, in giving them the law, and especially the second time in Deuteronomy, makes a great amount of emphasis on the behalf of God that these people, that you are not to abuse the widows or the fatherless. And we actually talked about it, I want to say it was in Matthew. I don't think it was in John. But we actually talked about that in Matthew, and what is the punishment that God lays out to those, whether it's leadership or anybody else in the nation of Israel. What would happen to them if they abused a widow or an orphan?
Is it death?
It would be death. So
Death by what?
no. You're right. But if the man ends up dying and he's married, has children, what would happen to his wife and to his children? They would become widows and they would be orphans. So the very ones that you're taking advantage of, God says your wife, your children are going to become that very thing. And there's the element of justice that God has. That's the whole eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth element. You're going to do this, here are the consequences. Yes?
But in all reality, when you look at that, at the law black and white, and you say, well, if you do this, then this happens. But the element of love, if they took care of and they thought of their neighbor as themselves, that would slip in there, and that would overwhelm whatever evil desire that they would have to do, because you couldn't do that to yourself.
That's
so
right.
You have the proper attitude.
That's right. And that's where Matthew 7 comes in. Do unto others, you'd have them do unto you. All right? If my wife became a widow, I would not want anybody abusing her. With that being the case, I will not abuse widows. That's just the natural flow of things. But that's one of the elements that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, that he ends up bleeding into Romans 2 with the Jews. One of the characteristics about the ungodly Gentiles that he lays out there is that they are without natural affection. That you would look at this and you just say, what are you thinking? What would possess a person to bring about harm, pain, suffering to somebody in this position? It's just what sin does. That's how sin corrupts. And that you get so deep in it, and that the one that everybody in society looks at, it's like, oh yeah, shouldn't do anything to them. But then that's the one they're going to go after. And so that's where we are in this chapter. And that's why the language is the way that it is. And especially considering that we're dealing with leaders, James 3, teachers, rather be not many masters, for you shall receive the greater condemnation. He's trying to get into stuff. Watch him. That's exactly where they are. Okay, you want to be leaders? This is the kind of treatment that leaders get. You don't get to pass the buck. You don't get to blame anybody else. You're the one that's in charge. So you better be careful what you do. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't want to get into leadership, is because they recognize, okay, I'm being held accountable to a whole lot, but that only depends on if people are actually going to hold them accountable. If nobody's going to hold the leaders accountable, they can do whatever they want to. Or if they end up getting into a position of power to where they end up corrupting the entire system, to where the ones that should have been holding them accountable the whole time do not hold them accountable. And that just creates problems all the way through. But on the point of leadership, this verse also says something about how they came to be leaders. He that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. How did they get to the position that they're in?
Made up.
It's made up. They did not go through the proper channels. During this time frame, the Old Testament is still in effect. Who was set by God to be a leader and guider of the people? The Levites, and particularly the priests inside of the tribe of Levi. Where are they? Okay, right. So remember, John the Immerser is from the tribe of Levi, and they took him out. But with the Pharisees, we know that the Pharisees are not made up of just the tribe of Levi, because Paul, was of what tribe? Benjamin. So here are the ones that God had said, okay, you're going to be the watchers over the people. You're going to be the leaders and guiders into what's holy and unholy, clean and unclean, righteous and unrighteous. Where are they? They've been set to the side. And now here are the Pharisees. Well, where do they come from? They weren't ordained of God. God never chose them. God never put them in the position where they are now. God never set them up, Matthew 23, to sit in Moses' seat. How'd they get there? They climbed up through some other way.
Like our government.
Yeah. But then the contrast. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. Jesus doesn't have to sneak in. He's not trying to come through some back way. He is right here, out in front of the people, proclaiming rightfully and justly who he is. He is that prophet that Moses spoke about. He is that shepherd that the Old Testament prophets were writing about that was supposed to come. He is the Messiah. He's the Son of God. So he has entered in by the door, and the door being a connection back to and a reference to fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Now, before we move forward, just a bit of application here. To look at these events during the life of Christ and just view it and say, okay, that's terrible. That here are these people in positions of leadership and they have no right being there. And how that they are abusing the people. And we're going to, as I said, read from Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and we'll get some descriptive terms on how abusive they're being. Well, the same thing is going on today. It is a sad thing today that millions of people will listen to and be led by blind leaders. People that have no right, no authority to be in the positions that they're in. To just think about people that are being led by blind, thieving, murderous people. And Jesus is going to throw that element in there a little bit later in John 10. He's going to add that element of killing as we move forward. And their sincerity will not change the fact of what they are and where they're leading the people. Matthew 15, they be blind, leaders of the blind. Jesus says the ditch is waiting for both of them. The blind leader will be lost, but then also the blind follower will be lost. There's no excuse for them. And that should really scare a lot of people, because they're going through their life thinking, I mean, that's primarily the debate that I'm having with David is, well, God's grace will just cover it. You're dreaming. To be willingly ignorant and willingly blind to what the truth is, God is not going to save that person. And so this is why every person needs to be a student of the Bible with an honest heart. We've already mentioned Paul, how that he was a Pharisee. Had he stayed a Pharisee, where would he have ended up? He would have ended up condemned in hell in the ditch. But why is it that he was able to change? Because he was honest. Okay. Quite literally. And he was already battling the things in his mind that were happening before his very eyes. And there lies the key, there lies the difference. Is that even with Paul being a Pharisee and the kind of zeal that he had for his party, and then the hatred that he had towards the church, and yet when the time came for him to face his error and to face his misunderstanding and his mistakes, he faced them. And he was willing to say, okay, I was wrong. And he changed. Oh, it's right there. I set up the extension cord and I just forgot to plug it in. And so people need to have the mindset that, you know what, I'm not going to believe anything that anyone teaches until I have seen and read it in my own Bible. This is the guide. This is the element. This is the parcel of truth. But now there's a scary situation about that. Did it die completely? Okay. All right. When we make that statement about, okay, I'm not going to believe anything that's taught until I can see it and read it in my own Bible. How is it that the Pharisees have wound up in the position that they're in?
People didn't read it. They didn't hold fast to the truth.
Okay.
And know what the old law said. And it was lost so that they were able to climb to power.
Okay.
Would it be that they did read it, but they came up with their own form of their own interpretation on how it reads, which made them better?
All right, everybody mark this day down on your calendar. Reese had the right answer over Jamie.
What? No.
No.
I was like, saying
not-
my mother.
It's not that Jamie had a wrong answer.
Megan.
It was a good answer. Because it is twofold. It's two parts. To where you have a society where, okay, the law is being read every Sabbath day. But just because you read something, does that mean you know what it says? No. I mean, there are people that have read this Bible 100 times through, but yet they do not understand. They do not know what Mark 16:15 through 16 says, or Acts 2:38 for that matter. So you have one group that, okay, it's being read and it's being listened to, but then they're not doing the Acts 17:11 thing of searching the scriptures for themselves. But then you have the other side of it, like the Pharisees, and they have come in and they've brought in their own traditions, their own doctrines, their own commandments, and they've perverted, they have poisoned what the truth is. Now, we've got the same thing going on today. All the denominations that we have throughout our community, you might as well look at them as different groups of the Pharisees. The reason why they exist is because they've come up with their own ideas, their own theology, their own form of doctrine, and they've established themselves. But here Jesus is, and he is saying to the people, we can maneuver through all of that. Well, the Pharisees say this, and it seems to make sense. Okay, fine. But here comes the Good Shepherd, and he's actually laying out to you what the truth is. Now, you can keep going that Pharisee way and keep going that way that you think sounds okay, but if Jesus comes along and teaches something, and this is what it says, then this is what it is. You can either accept it or you won't. And that's where we all have to be careful. Because we can all come along and start finding things that we think says what we want it to say, and manipulate that and blow it up and move it into an area where it does not belong. So, for example, I was in conversation with a brother just, I think it was Friday, and we were talking about some 80s, 70s stuff, and it has to do with that article that Caleb wrote. That's just so dumb. And his connection back to how that the 80-70 group, in order for their position to be true, they have to remove eternal punishment. Because if you're going to take the revelation as being a fulfillment and completely fulfilled at 80-70, well, one of the things that Jesus talks about is how that death and hell were cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. Okay, well, if that happened literally and was fulfilled at 80-70, what about hell and eternal punishment? They would be removed. So we're talking about that. And, we're bringing up cross-references and things that we've heard different ones use. And I can remember a few months ago when I talked to Holger about some of this, he wanted to try to use, I believe it's Psalm 103 and verse 9, where the psalmist writes, paraphrasing of course, and the statement is made on how that God's anger doesn't last forever. And it's just, okay, that's what that verse says. But when you go back into the context and you align it with everything else that we know about the Bible and God's character and his nature and his attributes, how would we make that fit? And it even talks about, it even makes reference to punishment also. Punishment's not everlasting, something like that, to that degree, and his anger is not forever.
Ask it again. Would you?
Now I can't remember how I asked it. How would we, in knowing what we know, so setting context to the side, but in knowing what we know about God, his character, his attributes, how can that verse be true that in fact his anger does not endure forever?
It'd be the ones that repent.
Okay. if you're going to repent, then God's anger will not stay. And even for that matter, when God's judgment comes into play against evil and wickedness, does he have any need for anger anymore? I mean, you don't think that God was angry with the people in Noah's day in Genesis chapter 6? Obviously he was, because he said, and that's written down, that it repented him that he had even created man. I would say he's in a deep state of consternation. But what about when the flood came and those people were gone? Then what about God's anger? No need for anger anymore. And then you take that in consideration with Old Testament Israel and how angry God was with his people. But the encouragement always was, repent. And that anger will be stayed. That wrath will be taken care of. There won't be any need for that anymore. But that's what people will do. And the sad thing is that Holger knows better. When it comes to debate, and especially, like dealing with Hebrew and Greek and different things like that, Holger is smart. But man, is he blinded. To try to take one passage like that out of its context, manipulate it against everything else that the Bible teaches, and then try to build a case that, there really is no eternal damnation anymore. Well, if there's no eternal damnation, how can there be eternal life? If there's no eternal punishment, how can there be eternal reward? Problems like that end up arising. Now that's an extreme aspect. But just think about all the things that we've had to face, that we've had to deal with, brethren, and pointing out and calling out sins that they're involved in, and how do they try to get around it? Same type of thing. Let's pull out a passage dealing with talking about compassion. That doesn't apply here. When you're dealing with a person and you're confronting them with their sin and they're not repenting, compassion is not an element here. They're being hard-headed. They're being hard-hearted. And if they're wanting to make bad arguments and misuse and manipulate the scriptures, like what the Pharisees are doing, and especially if they're in a position of leadership, now we know who we're dealing with. We're dealing with thieves and robbers. You shouldn't be in this position of leadership. What? What? Say it.
She called a name, and I just started naming off every other
okay.
one.
Well, we'd be here all day if we started that. But even with what Jesus is doing here, though it may not seem like it, this is a compassionate act. He could have just left them alone. Oh, they're just going to do what they want to do. Not called them out for anything. Not made an example of them. And Jesus would have been guilty, like everybody else, for allowing the Pharisees to get away with what they're getting away with. But he doesn't do it. So this all comes back to letting God lead me. That's what a shepherd does. A shepherd leads, and he takes the sheep where he wants them to go. And that's the mindset that I have to have. I'm wanting God to lead me, not anybody else. And if at any point I find myself in a position that I'm leading all of you in an area where we're not supposed to go, you either talk to me, get me back on track, or you get rid of me. And it'd be easy to do. You're all family.
Good.
I would argue,
Yes.
if that were the case, that we're all family, then we're not strictly adhering to rules.
Oh.
And treating everyone like family.
Got it.
I would say you call down your angel and will.
Yeah. Is he off on a walk? On journey? Is he
Could be.
sleeping? Where is he?
Could be.
Could
All right,
take you down to
so-
the lake.
These two chapters, 9 and 10, ought to cause a great deal of concern for men who would want the work of an elder. Where, in fact, this section lays a foundation for the kind of leadership that is supposed to be in the kingdom, in the fold, in his church. What it looks like to be a great leader. A pastor, shepherd, elders, it's the same office. Same thing, same responsibility. Acts 20:28, you watch over and you feed the flock of God, which is the church of God, which he shed his blood for. And thus, why we have the Hebrew writer writing like he does, Hebrews 13:17, that the church, the sheep, are to obey them that have the rule over you. Speaking of elders, submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls. This is what the eldership does. They are not there as managers over a bank account. They're not in this position to balance a checkbook, making sure the bills are paid, that the lights stay on. They watch for your souls, as they that must give account. You see, they cannot push it off to the side and say, well, this is just a troublesome sheep, and put the blame on them. They have to give an account. Hey, why didn't you tend to this? Why weren't you involved in this? That's a lot of hands-on type stuff that goes on if you're dealing with sheep. We need to spend more time out at Pablo and Janetta's. Because, I mean, just as we're going through it in a little bit of time that I've been out there to help them handle sheep, it's work. You got to get in there amongst them, kind of push them around a little bit to get them to do what you want them to do. When you're trying to give them medicine, it's even worse. And that's the imagery that we have going on here with elders. And like, okay, you got a sheep that's over here sick in sin and they got to take their medicine. All right, you cannot be afraid to get in there and throw your weight around. Depending on how ornery the sheep is, you might have to jump on top of it and wrestle it to the ground to get it to take what it needs. But then there's others, just like, okay, there's a little resistance, but once you get them, they stop resisting. They have to give an account that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you, the sheep. So what about the consequences of these shepherds who do not perform their responsibilities? Shepherds that are blind leaders, robbers and thieves. And the sheep have to wake up and they have to look around and say, well, where are they leading us? Where are we even going? What's the direction that we're even going in?
show the Acts 17 scripture with knowing your scriptures, because there is no safe place if you're not watching out for yourself and everyone else. It's just this constant thing that we have to do as Christians, whatever role we are in within the church.
Yeah.
Whether it's a new person, you know, having to give up their trust to have somebody to lead them, or somebody who's older who challenges somebody who's in the leadership role. Or, hey, I see you going off. You know, like some of the people we recently encountered this year, which aren't our elders or deacons, but just how it just we can't give up that responsibility wherever we're at.
Yeah. And the submission principle that's here, that's a contingency principle. Okay, I will submit and I will follow as long as you're doing what you're supposed to do. But if you start doing something that I am not supposed to do, that God has not commanded us that we're supposed to do, I don't have to follow you. And so when we go back into the Old Testament, and this will help to close us out, to move a little bit further next time, the Old Testament gives a great deal of background into the picture and view of the shepherd. Yes?
If you want to finish your point, you can. I was just going to bring up the fact that when you say leadership role, there is a leadership role that needs to take place, but everyone, especially here, are leaders in and of themselves.
Yeah,
And
it's a mutual.
yeah, that's where a lot of people go, well, no, I'm just a follower. And I'll read my Bible, I'll follow along with you, and if troubles arise, then I'll just sneak out quietly and go follow somebody else instead of dealing with the person, first of all. Or second of all, knowing that you are a leader and people don't want that role because, as you said earlier, then it's more strain on you, and like you're going to be held to a higher judgment. But everyone's a leader to a certain extent, because a good leader knows when to follow and when to take action. And that's for anyone that's here. If there's something that's going on that's wrong, you need to know when to take that action and not just follow along to get along.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to add on top of that with the leadership.
And you can see that illustrated all throughout the Old Testament also. I mean, Aaron making the golden calf, that all started because some followers decided to become leaders. Well, Moses is gone. It's been 40 days, 40 nights. More than likely, he's dead. Make us something. And Aaron had the chance to be a leader, and he failed. He went along with the crowd. And even in that situation, where more of the followers to become leaders should have stood up and said, nah, y'all just wait a minute. And the last thing we need to do is start going back to our old practices that we had in Egypt and creating idols. Just slow this down, and let's see what God actually says on this issue. And then even with the kings, for example, and they're being put into leadership, even though that's a position that God never intended for the children of Israel to have, you go through and you study the kings and you find how quickly good leaders can turn bad. When the kingdom's divided, and you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Israel never had a good king. The northern kingdom. But what you constantly find with the southern kingdom, Judah, good kings, but then they mess up. Good kings, and then they mess up. Just because it's easy to do. It is so easy in positions of power to start abusing and start using it for your own purposes. Using it how you want to use it instead of practicing how it should be. And part of what that goes to is the fact that when it comes to being in power, to stay in power, you have to keep people happy. But that's the one thing about leadership. You are not going to make everybody happy. You're going to make somebody upset. But if you're doing what's right, let them be upset. But as we said, Old Testament passages dealing with the idea of shepherds. Psalm 23, most of us are familiar with it. I'm sure most could even quote it if they desired. The Lord's my shepherd, shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, this is a picture of God as the shepherd. But we need to study some other shepherds that were going on, or that were involved in the time frame of Israel's history, and possibly some sections that are not as well known. Ezekiel 34, verse 1. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God unto the shepherds, Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? They're not concerned about the sheep. They're just thinking about themselves. Here are simple animals that are depending on them to be taken care of, and the only thing they can think of is themselves. Ye eat the fat, and ye clothe you with the wool. Ye kill them that are fed, but you feed not the flock. Not only do you not take care of them, but you're killing them so as to take care of yourselves. That's exactly what the Pharisees are doing. As we already mentioned, Matthew 23, Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites because they robbed widows and made long prayers to be seen of men. Feeding themselves when you should be feeding the flock. And how many preachers do we have throughout our community, throughout our state, throughout our nation, throughout the world, that are getting rich and fat off the backs of the sheep? And as we said, that's not just denominational, that's our own brethren too. They are feeding themselves without actually feeding the flock. We have so many congregations that are sickly and weak. But buddy, they got a preacher that'll get on the gospel meeting circuit, and he'll go place to place, town to town, city to city, and preach the roof in. But back home, the brethren are dying. And this is not hyperbole. This is not exaggeration. The fastest growing demographic that we had in Virginia with our television broadcast of people that were watching were members of the church. We had members of the church calling us more than we had denominational people, saying how much they wanted the kind of teaching that was being done because they weren't getting it where they were. But yet they have an eldership, they've got a preacher there, he's well paid, he's well fed physically, What are they getting spiritually? Nothing. Well, it's just all about keeping the people happy. Keeping them happy is a distraction from giving them what they're actually needing. And guidance and leadership. Verse 4, notice, the diseased have ye not strengthened. Here's a picture of what the shepherd is going to be doing, and buddy, it is not glamorous. The diseased have ye not strengthened, neither have ye healed that which was sick, neither have ye bound up that which was broken, neither have ye brought again that which was driven away, neither have ye sought that which was lost. Man, that's a lot of time being given to this. And then to start out with, you haven't strengthened, you haven't healed that which was sick. I've not really been around any really sick sheep. Closest thing I can get to is chickens, and let me tell you, some of the stuff they got going on, you don't want to be around. But if you're going to take care of them, you're going to take care of them. And that's the very first thing that they are condemned for. They're sick and you haven't healed them. But also notice everything in verse 4. They're sick, they need to be healed. They're broken, they need to be bound up. You haven't gone again with that which is driven away to bring them back. Doesn't that sound like Matthew 24:45? And that Jesus will make the faithful servant ruler over his household. And the word household means Matthew 24:45. He'll make the faithful servant a ruler over his household. This is one of my favorite passages. You're killing me.
See, what did you say that was part?
I said, this is one of my favorite passages. You're killing me right now. Spent a long time talking about it.
Place of therapy.
Therapy. Therapia. Isn't that what's going on here in verse 4? Isn't this therapy? It's what the shepherds are supposed to be doing. You got a sheep that's sick with sin? Go take care of him. You got one that's broken? Needs to be bound up? Okay, bind him up. Have one that went astray? Go out and look for him. Don't have the time. It's not that you don't have the time, you just don't have the interest. You just don't want to do it. Then why are you in this position? Well, somebody said I should be. Somebody nominated me, there was a motion, there was a second, everybody said yes in the vote, and I got it. But as we're talking about this from the standpoint of elders, this is the same kind of thing that if you're wanting to be a preacher or a teacher, this is what you better get ready for. And as we said, it is not glamorous. And if you're doing your job right as an elder, and in a lot of our congregations we have preachers that are also elders, if you're doing your job right, you do not have time to be gallivanting all over the country holding gospel meetings 6 months out of the year. That is ridiculous. You're an elder, and then you're going to try to say, oh yeah, I'm tending to the flock, and you're gone half the time. You better wake up. You're up all night, all day, taking care of these things. Watching out for predators. Watching out for the enemy that would come along and try to take one of your sheep away. But then notice how verse 4 ends. Here's what they were doing, or excuse me, here's what they should have been doing, but here's what they were doing. But with force and cruelty have you ruled them. Doesn't that sound like the Pharisees? John 9, why wouldn't the parents speak up for their son?
Fear.
Force and cruelty.
Because of force and cruelty. They feared the Pharisees because the Pharisees said, you confess him, we'll kick you out. That same type of tactic is going on today. Stand up to an eldership, call them out for something that they're doing that they shouldn't be doing, we'll just run you off. That's not how God's shepherds are supposed to behave. Now, don't get me wrong, withdrawal is a part of these things. But that's something that's held for the unruly, for people that are in sin that won't repent. That's not what's going on here. They were scattered because there is no shepherd, and they became meat to all the beasts of the field when they were scattered. My sheep wandered through all the mountains and upon every high hill. Yea, my flock was scattered upon all the face of the earth, and none did search or seek after them. Verses 5 and 6 sound like Matthew 9, 35 and 36. As Jesus was in Capernaum, and he healed many sick, cast out many demons, and they looked upon the multitudes that followed him. And the text tells us that he was moved with compassion because he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. All of this is fitting directly into what's happening with the life of Christ. History is repeating itself before their very eyes. And we've got that same history repeating itself today. But then you also take into consideration Jeremiah 23. Now, I would encourage you to, when you have time, to just go ahead and read all of Ezekiel 34. Because there's more to say about this matter that we don't have time to get into today. That's a strong thrust of it. But Jeremiah 23. Woe be unto the pastors, shepherds, pastors, that destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, saith the Lord. And that's one of the things that a lot of people do not recognize and that they do not understand about their position. Yes, you are in this position, but you really didn't earn it. You're placed in this position. And that creates a great balance that needs to take place within the mind of the leader. Is to recognize that, oh, these folks really do not have any obligation to follow me other than somebody above me put me here. That should humble you. And that should cause you to walk differently amongst the people that you're trying to lead. But a lot of people don't recognize this, just like here. These aren't your sheep. This isn't your pasture. This belongs to somebody else. So you don't get to run it how you think it ought to be run. You run it how the owner says to run it. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, against the pastors that feed my people, ye have scattered my flock and driven them away, and have not visited them. Behold, I will visit upon you the evil of your doing, saith the Lord. So there's that justice again. This is what you've done. It's going to be brought back on you. And I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all countries whither I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds, and they shall be fruitful and increase. And I will set up shepherds over them, which shall feed them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall they be lacking, saith the Lord. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch. And a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name whereby he shall be called the Lord our righteousness. In John 10, they are living in the very days that Jeremiah prophesied about. Okay, you have these shepherds that are not shepherds at all. They shouldn't have this position. They've come through some other way. So what are they doing? They're thieves and the robbers. They're stealing what belongs to God, taking it to themselves and using it for their own gain. But don't worry about it, because the true shepherd is here now. He's going to gather up that which was scattered. And even this section here, I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries which I've driven them. That is going to come into play in this chapter. In John 10, Jesus is going to use some of that same language as he talks about calling his sheep by name. He's not calling the entire nation. He's calling the individual. He is calling individual sheep by name, and they will come into his fold, into his flock. Out of the nation is going to be this remnant. Out of all countries. Who showed up on the day of Pentecost? Jews from every nation. And those are not just natural born Jews, those are proselytes. Gentiles that had converted, been circumcised. Here's the remnant, the flock out of all these countries. And they're being brought to the branch. The King, the Lord our righteousness, the shepherd. So what we're learning, what we're gaining from this brief, and well, I won't say brief, from this introduction is that the Lord's flock, the Lord's fold, will not function properly without the proper leadership. And that leadership is Christ at the top, and then men underneath that will acknowledge fully the authority and leadership of Christ. But in order to follow and acknowledge the authority of Christ, you have to first know the authority of Christ. And a lot of our elders don't even know that. They're not studying like they ought to, and then they want to try to turn around and lead people. It's part of the reason why the church is in the mess that it's in. And at the end of the day, it's just like this. It's sheep that are scattered. So while Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and laying out their problems, who else is he dealing with? The disciples. He's dealing with everybody else in Israel. Hey, you're lost just like the leaders are. You're out here scattered, wandering on hills, and you don't even know where you're going. Follow me. And that's the hard pill for everybody to swallow in recognizing, yeah, I am lost. The reason why it's a joke is because it's true on how it is that it's hard for men on a road trip to admit when they're lost. Now I know where I'm going. And here's your wife trying to tell you, no, you missed the exit 5 exits ago. No, I've got another way.
Got a shortcut.
Yeah. Just can't admit it. So Jesus is dealing with everything across the board. Yes, here are the leaders. Here's what they've done. But you know what? You sheep, you're lost too, but I'm here to wrangle you back. Okay. Bring us in. And as we move forward and we think, and we're going to have the picture for us, the blessings that if we will allow Him to bring us in, okay, it's worth it. No reason to fight it. So we'll pick up next time, verse 3, with the porter. And if you want to do some study ahead, I'm going to be asking, who is the porter? Because that's a significant point that needs to be considered. And I would argue to a large degree, I just read over that and didn't really take consideration of it before putting the study together. So, any thoughts, questions? The shepherds, pastors, leaders, Christ as the good shepherd. What?
I was waiting for anyone.
Oh, okay.
Anyone.
All right,
but-
no hands. We'll stop.